Today we explore a powerful psychological and spiritual truth. When an empath walks away, the narcissist's silent hell begins. At first glance, it appears to be a simple ending, a breakup, a distance, a goodbye. But beneath the surface, something far more profound is unfolding. An emotional shift that transforms both individuals in radically different ways. To understand this dynamic, we must begin with emotional dependency. Narcissistic personalities are not sustained by love. They are sustained by reflection. They require admiration, emotional reactions, validation, and constant reassurance to stabilize their fragile sense of self. This is often referred to as emotional supply. Without it, their internal structure begins to weaken. An empath, on the other hand, possesses heightened emotional awareness. They feel deeply, they give deeply, they attempt to heal, to understand, to absorb pain that does not belong to them. In many relationships, the empath becomes the emotional regulator, the stabilizer of chaos. They soothe, forgive, excuse, and tolerate beyond healthy limits. But something remarkable happens when emotional intelligence matures. The empath begins to recognize patterns. They notice manipulation disguised as vulnerability. They detect inconsistency between words and actions. They realize that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And in that moment of clarity, the most powerful act occurs. They withdraw. When the empath walks away, they do not always shout. They often leave quietly, calmly, with dignity. And it is this silence that creates the narcissist's internal storm. Because suddenly, the mirror is gone. The narcissist can no longer project blame and receive comfort in return. They can no longer provoke emotional reactions to feel powerful. They can no longer rely on unconditional understanding to escape accountability. What remains is something they have long avoided themselves. This is the silent hell. It is not dramatic on the outside. There may be new distractions, new relationships, new performances. But internally, something destabilizes. The absence of the empath removes the emotional cushion that once absorbed insecurity. Without constant admiration, unresolved shame begins to surface. Without someone to blame, internal emptiness becomes louder. Psychologically, this is significant. When a person depends on others to regulate self-worth, abandonment triggers identity disturbance. The narcissist may attempt to reestablish control through hoovering, through sudden affection, through indirect messages. Not because they miss the empath's soul, but because they miss the emotional stability the empath provided. Meanwhile, the empath experiences something entirely different. Initially, there may be grief, confusion, even guilt. Empaths often question themselves because they are wired to assume responsibility for emotional harmony. But as time passes, clarity strengthens, energy returns, anxiety decreases. The nervous system begins to regulate. What the empath discovers is profound. Peace was not found in fixing someone else. It was found in choosing themselves. This is the divergence of paths. The empath grows through reflection. Pain becomes wisdom. Boundaries become strength. Emotional intelligence deepens because they are willing to confront discomfort and learn from it. The narcissist, however, faces a crossroads. Growth would require self-awareness, the courage to acknowledge insecurity, fear, and emotional dependency. But without that willingness, the cycle simply repeats with someone new. The true lesson here is not about revenge or punishment. It is about emotional consequences. When you build your identity on external validation, losing someone who truly sees you feels catastrophic. When you build your identity on internal awareness, walking away feels liberating. So if you are the empath who walked away, understand this: your silence is not weakness. It is self-respect. It is the decision to stop participating in emotional imbalance. And if you study this dynamic from an educational lens, you recognize a universal truth. Emotional intelligence determines destiny in relationships. One person avoids self-confrontation and lives in constant pursuit of supply. The other embraces self-awareness and evolves. When the empath walks away, the narcissist's silent hell begins not because they lost a person, but because they lost the emotional structure that was protecting them from themselves. And growth for both depends on what they choose to face next. To understand the collapse of emotional supply, we must first understand what emotional supply truly is. For a narcissistic personality, validation is not simply pleasant, it is essential. Admiration, attention, reassurance, even conflict, all of these become psychological fuel. They temporarily stabilize a fragile inner world that lacks secure self-worth. Without this external reinforcement, the narcissist does not merely feel disappointed. They feel destabilized. An empath often becomes the primary source of this supply. Because empaths are emotionally attuned, they respond quickly to distress. They comfort, they reassure, they attempt to repair tension. Over time, this dynamic creates an imbalance. One person regulates emotions internally, while the other depends on external regulation. The empath gives understanding. The narcissist absorbs it as validation. The empath absorbs blame. The narcissist avoids accountability. But when the empath walks away, something critical happens. The supply line is cut, the constant stream of attention disappears. The emotional reactions that once reinforced control are gone. There is no longer someone softening consequences or reflecting an inflated image back to them. In psychological terms, this creates a supply shock. The internal insecurity that was once masked by admiration begins to surface. This is why the collapse feels intense. It is not about love lost, it is about identity threatened. Without supply, unresolved shame, fear of inadequacy, and emotional emptiness rise to awareness. Meanwhile, the empath begins to regain energy and clarity. The one who once gave stability now reclaims it, and the narcissist must confront the reality that validation borrowed from others was never the same as self-worth built from within. The collapse of emotional supply is ultimately the collapse of illusion. The empath's awakening does not happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually through emotional exhaustion and quiet realization. At the beginning of the relationship, the empath believes that understanding is the solution. If they love more, explain better, forgive deeper, or remain patient longer, harmony will return. Their emotional intelligence allows them to sense pain beneath harmful behavior, and they often mistake that insight for responsibility. But awareness grows when patterns repeat. The empath begins to notice that empathy is not reciprocated. Their apologies are frequent, yet accountability from the other side is rare. They recognize cycles, idealization followed by devaluation, affection followed by withdrawal. Slowly, a powerful shift occurs. They stop asking, "How can I fix this?" and start asking, "How can I fix this?" This question marks the awakening. Awakening is not anger. It is clarity. It is the moment the empath understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Emotional intelligence, when fully developed, includes not only understanding others but protecting oneself. The empath realizes that absorbing another person's unresolved insecurity does not heal it. It only drains them. Boundary formation is the practical expression of this awakening. A boundary is not punishment. It is definition. It communicates what behavior is acceptable and what is not. For the empath, setting boundaries may feel uncomfortable at first because they are accustomed to prioritizing emotional harmony. Yet true harmony cannot exist without mutual respect. When the empath establishes boundaries, they reclaim their emotional energy. Anxiety decreases. Self-trust increases. They begin to feel grounded rather than reactive. The awakening transforms empathy from a vulnerability into strength. It teaches that love must include self-respect. And in forming boundaries, the empathy does not become cold. They become balanced, mature, and emotionally sovereign. When the empath walks away and the emotional supply collapses, the narcissist is left with something they have long avoided: the inner void. This void is not simply loneliness. It is the absence of a stable internal identity. For many narcissistic personalities, self-worth has been constructed externally, dependent on admiration, control, or superiority. Without constant reflection from others, the internal structure begins to feel hollow. The empath once acted as a mirror, reflecting validation, absorbing blame, softening insecurity. When that mirror disappears, projection becomes more difficult. There is no longer someone readily available to carry emotional discomfort. What remains is unfiltered self-awareness, and for unprepared to face it. This can feel overwhelming. Confronting the self requires emotional maturity. It demands the ability to tolerate shame without deflecting it, to acknowledge fear without disguising it as anger, and to accept vulnerability without turning it into manipulation. But for a narcissistic personality, these skills are often underdeveloped. As a result, the inner void feels threatening. This is why the period after separation may appear contradictory. Externally, the narcissist might seek distractions, new relationships, achievements, attention, in an attempt to refill the emptiness. Internally, however, unresolved insecurity remains untouched. The void persists because external substitutes cannot replace internal stability. The silent discomfort that follows is not punishment. It is psychological consequence. When identity is built on image rather than authenticity, any loss feels like collapse. Confronting the self becomes unavoidable when there is no one left to blame. True transformation would require introspection and accountability. Without it, the void remains a constant companion, quiet, persistent, and impossible to silence through external validation alone. When the empath walks away and the emotional dynamic collapses, both individuals face consequences, but the direction of those consequences depends entirely on emotional maturity. This is where the paths begin to diverge. For the empath, the initial phase may involve grief, confusion, and even self-doubt. Because empaths are naturally reflective, they often examine their own behavior first. They ask difficult questions. They analyze their boundaries. They search for lessons. This willingness to self-reflect becomes the foundation of growth. Pain, when processed consciously, transforms into wisdom. The empath learns to distinguish compassion from overextension, love from attachment, and responsibility from self-sacrifice. Over time, emotional resilience strengthens. Self-trust deepens. The relationship becomes not just an ending, but a catalyst for evolution. For the narcissist, the emotional consequences unfold differently. Without developed self-awareness, discomfort often triggers avoidance rather than reflection. Instead of examining internal patterns, there may be attempts to replace the lost connection quickly. Distraction becomes a coping mechanism, yet unresolved insecurity follows wherever they go. Because growth requires accountability, and accountability requires humility. Progress remains limited without conscious effort. This divergence reveals an essential truth. Emotional pain does not automatically create growth. Reflection does. Two people can experience the same separation and emerge entirely different. One chooses introspection and develops emotional intelligence. The other resists self-examination and repeats familiar cycles. Over time, the empath moves towards stability and authenticity. Their relationships become healthier because their standards become clearer. Meanwhile, without intentional change, the narcissist may remain trapped in patterns of dependency on external validation. In the end, the separation is not simply a loss. It is a crossroads. Growth belongs to the one willing to face themselves.